Hello, everyone. This is Father Al Seski, pastor of St. Joan of Arc in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I'm doing my second episode of the Women Doctors of the Church. We began by talking about St. Hildegard of Bingen, who was this wonderful woman in the Middle Ages, and today we're going to talk about St. Catherine of Siena. St. Catherine of Siena was an amazing woman. She only lived to be 33 years old, but she was this powerhouse in the life of the church at a time when the church was truly in need of real leaders, real saints. St. Catherine was born in the Italian city of Siena in the year 1347 on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation. And she was the daughter of Giacomo and Lapa. Her mom's name was Lapa Piagente. And she was, if you can believe this, the 24th child out of 25 children. Many of her brothers and sisters were twins, and so we can sort of understand that. She herself was a twin, and her twin died at childbirth, while Catherine survived. She was a very happy child, so much so that the family gave her the nickname Euphrosine, which is Greek for joy. She was this joyful, happy child. Well, St. Catherine of Siena began having mystical experiences at age 6, and she dedicated herself to God at the age of 7. She gave herself completely and wholly to God as this little girl. When she was around 15 years old, her sister, Bonaventura, died, and her sister was married to a man, and the family wanted her to marry her sister's husband after her sister died. And St. Catherine would have nothing to do with that. She refused, and she began a strict fast, and she cut her hair, and she made it very, very clear that God was calling her to remain a virgin and to give her life in service to him. And so the family finally relented, and they did not make her marry her deceased sister's husband. Well, her life was very fascinating. She spent many hours in prayer, but at the same time, she spent much time caring for the poor and the sick in the city of Siena. She advised others, build a cell in your mind from which you can never flee. She was lived a very simple life, and that in her own mind and in her own home, she was able to live almost the simple life of a cloistered nun, while at the same time, she had this great, great love and devotion to the poor and to the sick, of which there were many in Siena. She was drawn to a group of women in Siena called the Mantellate, which were Dominican tertiaries, meaning third-order Dominicans, who wore the habit and gave their lives in chastity, poverty, and obedience, but they did not live as cloistered nuns. In her lifetime, her dialogues, which was written down, I had mentioned earlier when I was talking about the doctors of the church, that they're oftentimes known for their writings. And St. Catherine of Siena was especially known for her writings, and her dialogues was published throughout Europe, and they made her famous. St. Catherine, in her lifetime, her short lifetime, she intervened in the affairs of the church and state, and she helped bring back the Pope to Rome from Avignon. At this time, the popes were living in southern France, really kind of on the Riviera, and because of political turmoil in Italy at the time, the popes had basically made their headquarters, had made the headquarters of the church in Avignon, France. And so for many, many years, decades, the Pope was no longer living in Rome. And this was a scandal to many, and it was a scandal to St. Catherine as well. She died at the age of 33 after she had a stroke. St. Catherine of Siena considered herself to be the bride of Christ. She lived in solitude for around 3 years in her family home, and she was praying and she was fasting. She was oftentimes taking long periods of silence in self-mortification, probably what we would consider to be extreme with the fasting and with the penitential practices. And she spent those 3 years in contemplation, in trying to find out who she was in the eyes of God and what God was calling her to do in this world. Around the age of 20, she had this amazing vision which changed her life forever. She had this vision that she was mystically married to Christ, and that Jesus came to her and he gave her a wedding ring which was invisible to all but herself. She gave herself at this time in a very real way, even though as a young girl she had already dedicated herself to God. She gave herself to Christ and to him alone, and that she promised that she would serve him through others. In a powerful vision, she asked Christ to take her heart and will, and Christ came in this vision and he removed her heart. Imagine that. He then takes his own heart and places it within her breast. For St. Catherine of Siena, the heart of Christ, what we commonly call the Sacred Heart, is the image of love, union, intimacy, and self-giving. For St. Catherine of Siena, it wasn't that Christ was just someone out there. Christ was truly within her, that Christ dwelled within her soul, and she had this intimate relationship with the Lord, a nuptial relationship in which she was united to him in this intimate, holy way. St. Catherine of Siena really understood herself in relationship to God's love. The Lord said to her, "You are she who is not, and I am he who is." And she recognized that a sign of her humility, not that we are nothing, but rather in comparison to God's transcendence and God's majesty, we are so tiny, we are so little, and yet God reaches down to us and he allows us to be part of his life, to be in a relationship with him. Reminds you of a little bit of Saint Therese of Lisieux, whom we'll talk about later, but about that littleness of God, that God reaches down to her and brings her to himself. Saint Catherine of Siena had a wonderful understanding of that as well. She was so humble, she recognized that God sharing his life with her was truly a gift that she didn't deserve. It was this undeserved gift that God had given to her, and all she could do in great humility was to accept it. One of her most famous images that she had in a vision is that of Christ the bridge. She said that he is the bridge between heaven and earth, between the human and the divine, most perfectly on the cross. She realized that Jesus Christ is truly the way, the truth, and the life that leads to union with the divine. And when she was thinking about Jesus as the bridge and having the image of the cross before her, she says that that bridge has 3 steps: the feet of Christ, the heart of Christ, and the mouth of Christ. And if we think about a crucifix in which we could contemplate, or which St. Catherine was looking at, she recognized that these were 3 steps to divine union. And she saw that contemplating the feet of Christ was moving away from earthly affections and sin. That, very simply, that if we're going to walk with Christ, we are going to move away from sin and to put behind us all those things which are only earthly as compared to those things which are from heaven. As she contemplated the heart of Christ, and as she looked at the crucifix and looked at the pierced heart of Jesus, she said, this is the place where you really learn how to love. And not just in some superficial way, but to love deeply, to love God with all your heart and mind and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then finally, as she contemplated the face of Christ, the mouth of Christ, she says that you finally come to have an experience of peace, that Christ kisses you with his mouth, and in that kiss, you find divine peace, divine union with the Lord. You know, these images and these visions are profound in her life. One of the things that's so wonderful about St. Catherine of Siena is that she recognized that in this great experience of union with Christ and with God and the Holy Spirit that she experienced in prayer, that it meant that she was called to put what she learned in prayer into action in serving others in this world of ours. You know, she had a beautiful line that she said, love of God and love of neighbor are the two wings which flies you to heaven. And she recognizes that by doing the most simple thing, that you can recognize that God is in everything. In her own home, she began to do menial housework, washing the dishes and sweeping the floors, doing embroidery and work, helping with her family. And in these very simple actions, she was able to acknowledge that God was present. But she doesn't just stay there within her home either. She goes out into the city, and she has a special love for the sick and the poor. As a matter of fact, she becomes so famous in the city of Siena that there are older women at this time, probably widows and people in the city of Siena, who look toward her and they see her as a real role model of what it means to be a saint. As a matter of fact, these old women see in St. Catherine of Siena such a woman of wisdom and of knowledge that they start to call her Mama, that she is their Mama, that she is the one who is able to tell women 2 and 3 times her age the ways of God. But not only does she reach out to the sick and the poor in the city, but she also reaches out to the greater world, the secular world and the world of the church, and she starts to bring people together. She's known as the Doctor of Unity because of her interventions in bringing peace to a very divided world. There was great divisions in the church, divisions within the secular world. There were so many kind of wars between the different city-states there in Italy and in France and in Germany, and there was so much confusion, and she was able to bring people together. She had a special love for those who were most wretched in this world. And I'm sure that in Siena at that time that she was able to reach out and to see all those whom everyone else had abandoned, and she went and cared for them. Well, we ask ourselves, what can we learn from St. Catherine of Siena? I love this quote that's up here. It says, "Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire." Isn't that amazing? I say that all the time. We can't be St. Catherine of Siena. We can't be St. Francis of Assisi or St. Teresa of Avila. But rather, we are called to be who God has created us to be. And each of us is called to be a saint. And I have to be St. Alcestis. You have to be the saint God calls you to be. And so, but we can learn from St. Catherine what it means to be a saint, what it means to be holy. The first thing that is so important is that we have to have a deep prayer life. You know, so many of her visions, so much of her wisdom came from contemplating the mysteries of God, by praying each and every day, by spending time in silence. And so from all the saints, but I think from St. Catherine of Siena in a very real way, we need to learn the importance of prayer. Also, the importance of being humble. Humility is at the heart of our Christian faith. And she recognized that she wasn't God, and she recognized that she was this young girl in this world in which men were the dominant powers in this world, and yet she knew that she had a role to play. And she used all of her gifts and talents as best as she could. She was humble about who she was, but she was also humble about who she was not. The other thing that is so wonderful about St. Catherine of Siena is she has this great love of God and neighbor. She realizes that the two great commandments of the Christian faith is love of God and love of neighbor. And she put that in practice every day of her life. She had this great understanding of who she was, this simple young girl, and yet she was the bride of Christ. So she had an understanding of her own self-worth. She had a self-esteem that wasn't filled with pride, but rather she recognized that everything she had and everything she was a gift from the Lord. She did have a life filled with self-mortification. And as I said, most likely that probably did hurt her health, and she did die young. And at that time, there was a lot more kind of self-mortification that we may say was probably a little extreme. And yet all of us can eat less, can exercise more, pray more, be silent more, do the things that we need to do in order to mortify our bodies so that we can use our bodies for God's glory and for building up the kingdom here on earth. And so always in moderation, and yet who among us probably couldn't mortify ourselves a little bit more? Here was a young woman who was truly selfless. Probably as a young girl, she gave herself completely and totally to God. And so she allowed God to use her as best as he could. And she was selfless in giving her life for others. She wasn't a woman who thought about herself at all, but only of God and of others. And then finally, I think with St. Catherine of Siena, we can learn that what is at the heart of our Christian faith is that relationship with Jesus Christ. She saw herself as the bride of Christ, of having this nuptial relationship with the Lord. Each of us can use our different own images and our own iconography as far as our relationship with the Lord. But for all of us, men and women alike, we have to have this deep, loving relationship with the Lord Jesus. Ultimately, that is what it means to be a Christian, that we have a relationship with Christ. Brothers and sisters, I think St. Catherine of Siena, in many ways, she may seem kind of a strange saint, but she was a woman of her time. She was a woman who taught us so much about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. May we learn from St. Catherine of Siena. I encourage you to read her writings to learn more about her life. And most importantly, to imitate her in her devotion to the Lord. Thanks so much. And next week, probably the week after Holy Week, we'll talk about St. Teresa of Avila.